So this is the last week in our caring sermon series. So far we've affirmed that we believe in a caring, compassionate God who calls us to show care to creation and to show care to each other. As I was writing the sermon, I was reflecting, I am so grateful for the people who show care to me. I'm so grateful for the people who support me. I'm not going to list them all off here this morning, but there is a person in this congregation who regularly checks in with me and asks how my fatigue levels are going and holds me accountable. And so they ask the question, where are you on the scale of 0, which is I'm feeling refreshed and totally on top of things, through to 10, which is I'm totally exhausted, burned out and ready to collapse? Where's my fatigue levels of that? I thought Rob Williams was not going to be here today, so that's why I'm using this example, and he goes and turns up on the back. I don't know. How would you answer that question? How is your fatigue levels going? Now, when Rob does this to me, you don't have the option just to think it in your head. You've got to say it out loud. So what? Hold up your fingers. How's your fatigue levels going? Are you a 0, you're going great? Or are you a 10, you're ready to collapse like Eric? No. No, come on, I'm holding you accountable. Come on. Where are you? Most people are one hands, but there's a number of people who've got 2 hands up. All right. Number of people who didn't respond, by the way. In this modern lifestyle that we have, our work, our families, our relationships seem to demand a lot from us. And while we want to be people who care, while we want to be people who give of ourselves and make a difference in our communities, sometimes it feels like, I don't know, our inner well is a bit empty, and it's very hard to give of ourselves in care and compassion when we're feeling a bit run down ourselves. Over the past month, I've heard comments like this. I'm okay, I'm tired, but aren't we all? Or I just feel like I haven't had a break in ages. Or I'm too busy at the moment to worry about fatigue. Or I'm just exhausted all the time. How do we care for others if we're exhausted all the time? I'm not really the right person to do this sermon. Well, maybe I am. I don't know. We'll see how we go. If I do some self-reflection on this, I have to admit, Rob, that it's probably, a 7 pushing an 8 this week, because it's not been a good week for me. Not only have I been doing a lot, I've been feeling the effects of that this week more than previous weeks. And I seem to be doing a lot of worrying at the moment, which is draining. I worry about the church, I worry about the future of the church, I worry about what needs to be planned and done before Mary and I go on some holidays soon. And when this tiredness and worry gets to a level, it begins to stir up other stuff in me that I don't like frustration. And all of that is draining. And on the top of that, on Friday was the anniversary of my sister's death from last year. And whilst I think I'm going fine with that, I wonder whether there's been more in that I'm realising. And so as I was writing this sermon, I was writing, if I'm honest, I am tired, I am drained, and my inner world does feel pretty low. During the second COVID lockdown, I actually got in contact with a psychologist from the organisation called the Kindness Pandemic, and we interviewed her online for one of our services. Do you remember that, when we had that time with Rose Glassock? It was really interesting because she approached it not what I was expecting, but rather this is what you people need to know to cope with what you're going through right now. And there were some really good things in that. It's probably worth going back and watching that again. But there were some really good things in that about 35 minutes she did with us. So good that I just want to remind you of a few of them today if we're talking about caring for ourselves. Firstly, she put up this a little graph that sort of showed that it's not like we're either going great or not going great. It's like how Rob does. There's a scale of how we're going. And she wanted to sort of say, we can be excelling in our lives, or we could be in crisis in our lives, but most people are not on either end. Most people are somewhere in the middle. And so she had a number of things to reflect upon of whether we are thriving or going pretty good or doing okay or just surviving or struggling or in crisis. But the thing that jumped out of what Rose said, which was really, really helpful, was she sort of said, it's not about feeling, well, I'm only just surviving. How am I going to get back to thriving or excelling? That just seems too hard. And Rose said, the key is, what is some things that you can do to go one step to the left? How can you go from surviving to doing okay? That's all you need to do. Just take those little steps and try to care for yourself enough to slightly improve how you're going. It's a really great point to hold on to as we dive back into our Bible readings for today. And we had two of them, probably biased to how I was feeling, because there's other ways of self-care, but they were both about rest. And so the first one came from the Gospel of Mark. And we read this line, the apostles have returned and are catching up with Jesus, and everything is happening to the point that they did not even have a chance to eat. All right, another time of honesty. Who this week has missed a meal because they were too busy? Who has not had lunch at least one day this week because they were too busy? Go on. Is that all? Seriously? I thought I was going to get half the congregation then. Oh, well, good on you. Don't worry about this part of the sermon. No. Jesus and his disciples didn't have a chance to eat. And so Jesus says to his disciples this beautiful line, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. He said, this is crazy. Let's just stop, find a quiet place and rest for a little bit. So just in some context here, what happens just before this passage is that Jesus sends off the 12 disciples to go and do mission in the surrounding towns. And they're off doing that, and they've just returned. So you could just imagine if you've ever done beach mission or other sort of stuff where that intensive work with the community. And they've come back from that. So they must have been tired already. And they've turned back up, and there's this huge crowd around Jesus needing help. And Jesus is in the middle of that, teaching and helping. And they've turned up and have joined in. And so you can imagine why they're tired. In the same period, Jesus also gets news that John the Baptist has died. So Jesus is not only busy, but grieving as well. There's some similarities to my week here. Have you noticed that? But anyway, moving on. And so it was in the midst of this busyness, the coming down of an intensive period of work and grief, that the disciples and Jesus were exhausted. And that is why Jesus said, let us go to a quiet place and get some rest. We often undervalue how important rest is. The biblical principle of the Sabbath, taking a day a week just to stop and rest, is important because physical rest is good for our soul. We undervalue the importance of that. We put more value on, no, we just got to keep going and get everything done. But there is a biblical principle to stop and rest. Early on in my ministry, I was seeing a psychologist for a whole other story, ask me later, for another reason. But she kept on wanting to go, no, we're dealing with that, that's fine. But here's what you have to tell your congregation. She wanted to share tools with me, not only to help myself, but to help my congregation. And one of the things that she said to me, she said, if anybody is struggling in life, whether that's with mental health or just pure exhaustion, she said, ask these 3 questions, because these 3 questions do more for mental health than anything. She said, how are you sleeping? How's your diet? And are you getting some exercise? She said, those 3 things do more for mental health, more for making us cope better than a whole bunch of other stuff. The other stuff's important too, don't get me wrong. That's what psychologists are there for. But this is the starting point. So if I'm hitting a mark at the moment with you and you're feeling tired or exhausted or run down or overwhelmed or whatever, are you taking some time to rest? How are you sleeping? How's your diet? Are you getting some exercise? Honestly answer those questions. These 3 things are critical. Self-care is important. Another gem of wisdom by Rose Glassick in that series that we did back then, she said, we're all different people, so the way that we care for ourselves is different. And she put up this screen, which talked about a variety of different ways that we can self-care. They can vary widely. Like she said, with physical care, things like going for a walk, but there's also emotional care, like journaling or going to therapy. There's social care, like meeting with friends, spiritual care, like prayer or meditation, personal care, by doing something creative or working on a hobby. There's also care about addressing the things that are weighing you down, by maybe cleaning up your home or paying the bills or setting some boundaries at work. All of these things are self-care, and that's what Rose Glassick was saying. All of these things help us. But some of these will help you more than the person next to you. So you need to do some self-reflecting on the best way to do self-care for you. Whatever it is, Jesus is right. If we are tired or exhausted or overwhelmed or need space, Jesus says, come with me. Let us go and get some rest. Or as it says in Matthew 28, our second reading, when Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Are you hearing this? You will find rest for your souls. It's good, isn't it? But there is a complication, and I like mentioning the complications in my sermon. If we jump back to the Mark reading, what happens? Jesus says, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and we'll get some rest. And so they jump in a boat and they go off to a quiet place by themselves. And what happens? The crowd work out where they're going and they race ahead and they tell other people where they're going. And there's a whole crowd waiting for them when they get there. And so what happens? That Jesus says, no, we've got to go to another place. No, his heart was filled with compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And instead of resting, Jesus went to teach them many things. And if you actually keep reading the Bible passage after this, and then he calls upon the disciples who are also tired and need some rest to feed them. And this is where the story of the 5,000, feeding of the 5,000 come in. This is the problem, isn't it? Yes, Jesus and the disciples are exhausted, they're grieving, they desperately need some rest, but they're also good and kind and compassionate people for whom the call to care is greater than their need to rest. But that is a problem, isn't it? Our heart goes out to people who need help. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing completely. It's part of the call that we have to care. For example, this week, in the midst of everything that I was going on, in the drained, tired place that I was finding myself, and I knew I was there, a local funeral director I get on quite well with gave my number to a person who was looking for a minister. And she rang up and said, "Oh, yeah, the funeral director gave me your number." And I'm going, "Thanks." The funeral director actually said, "Ring Phil, he'll look after you." And I did. Why? Because he was a person who needed help, who needed care and support and compassion, and I responded. Because that is the person we're called to be, isn't it? And that's why Jesus and disciples, when they saw all the crowd there, didn't keep sailing in the boat. They jumped out and they helped. So what's the best wisdom to handle this then? How do we balance this tension between the need to come to Jesus and get some rest, which I've just said is a good biblical principle of Sabbath? How do we balance that with this call to care? We have this call, but we also need to care for ourselves. And we sit in this tension. So what is the wisdom? See, we've come to this sermon after two more sermons before this, where Ian challenged us to care for creation and said it was our calling. We all had to do it. Last week, I said we had to care for one another, that it was a biblical instruction. And I don't think we get a choice to opt out of those two things, do we? We have to do it. It's part of our calling. But how do we call when our inner well is empty? How do we care when our inner well is empty? How do we care when we're exhausted? How do we hold these two things together? Once again, I am not the right person to be preaching on this. Because I struggle with this so much. I finished my sermon at about 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, which is really early for me. And then I had 3 drop-ins between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock on a Friday. Who drops in to see a minister between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock on a Friday? I said to Daniel, I walked out and said, "This afternoon is totally weird. What is happening here?" Of people who were calling because they needed help or care or compassion. So how do we do this? Well, some of you might already know, but if you don't, ask about us later. Mara and I are just about to take some time away to go overseas for a month in 3 weeks' time. Did you know that? Hopefully people have been hearing about that. And part of that is a response to these things are good to refill your inner well. We're taking time out to rest. And yet it's been the thing that has caused me great worry in the last month because I'm trying to plan everything for when I'm away. I worry too much. See, I don't do this tension very well, do I? I'm not the person to ask of how to handle this. So maybe I can share 3 pieces of advice that other people have tried to give to me to help me in my tension, and I will share that with you. The first piece of advice has been told to me numerous times over the years, the latest by my GP, who says this to me, which is, we can't care for others if we don't care for ourselves. If we have run down and our inner well is empty, we can't give of that to others. My GP is a bit blunter. If I have a heart attack and die, I can't care for anybody else, can I? We can't care for others if we don't care for ourselves. Jesus in the commandments talk about how we are to love our neighbour. You said it this morning, Paul. To love our neighbour, what's the second part? As we love ourselves. They're intertwined. We can't do one without the other. Maybe we can understand that it's only by loving and caring for ourselves first that we actually do the best in loving and caring for others. The next piece of advice, it's not all dependent upon you. Told you I'm not the right person to say these things, am I? We are not the only ones who are called to care. If we can't do it, there are others who will or could or might or hopefully step up and do it as well. No, there are people who are around who can do this as well. It doesn't mean we can opt out altogether. That's not our calling. But it does mean that we don't have to carry the burden of a situation or of a particular care or a call to help all by ourselves. Galatians 6:2 encourages us to bear each one another's burdens. This is a picture that I still remember from the Good News Bible. Does anybody remember the pictures in the Good News Bible? And this is the one from Galatians 6:2, which I just love it. It's like, yes, we're all carrying these burdens, but we're all helping each other as we do that. And I think that's the idea, that it's not all dependent upon us. There are other people around who can do this too. And the last piece of advice, which I've already mentioned numerous times in this sermon already, is this idea of the inner well. It is an image that has helped me immensely in my struggle. It's probably the most helpful thing that has been taught to me over my years. In simplest terms, if our well is empty, then we've got nothing to give in our care for others. And so it's so important to do that self-care. So important to find those times of rest. So important for us to go to Jesus and find rest for our souls. Find those things that refill our inner well so that we have the ability to show care and support to others. Jesus says to each one of us, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." I'm going to stop here. I'm going to invite the band to come up, and they're going to sing a song. We will take up the offering during the song, but I actually want us to more focus on just being in this moment, opening ourselves up to Jesus, to come to Jesus and find rest for our souls. Let's do that right now. Amen.